This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and today I'm joined by Tony Black. Hi, Tony. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Duncan. Yeah, not too bad. I am happy to be jumping back onto the good ship Primitive Culture, having successfully launched many spin-offs over the last few years. That's not true.
I was going to say, I'm tearing you away. I know I'm tearing you away from a book deadline. So, there's probably something else you've got your mind on at the moment. Yes,
I'm currently finishing up writing all about Sean Connery and his movies for a book. So it's a whole other kind of world my mind's in, as apart from Star Trek. Although there is a Star Trek connection in the book, which some people probably already know, but it'll be interesting to find out. Yeah, Shakari. Yeah, that does get a mention.
Shakari, yeah. Very good. I'm glad to hear it.
But no, I had to pop back for this.
I know. I was thinking if I'd been really clever, I would have set this episode up as a backdoor pilot for another podcast. But I was not that on the ball. But yeah, we're talking about backdoor pilots, which, for anyone who's not familiar with the term, is basically when a TV show creates an episode that is designed to serve as a sort of unofficial pilot or a proof of concept for another show. And the most obvious example within Star Trek history is Assignment Earth, which was intended as a kind of a spin-off series, essentially, that it would have been with Gary Seven and Roberta Lincoln. And this is what we would have had, when Star Trek went off the air, I suppose. But obviously, that's not how things panned out.
Well, it seemed to be partly down to the constant back and forth in terms of cancellations that Star Trek was threatened with in the 1960s. So, you had in 1967, which was roughly 1968, when the second series was coming to an end, there was lots of talk about, is this it? Is this going to be the end of the show? And then you had, and people will listen to this, I'm sure, know all about the fan writing, things that happened, organised by super fans like B. Joe Trimble and all these people in the 60s, who then petitioned NBC to keep it going and managed to do it. But in that period, Roddenberry, who had been intermittently involved, I think, in the second season, people like Gene Coon were running it, John Meredith Lucas, people like that. He'd got his eye on other different things at the same time. So he was doing different pilots at various different points, because he did lots of different pilots during, before and after Star Trek. And so he'd got his eye on various different things, and one that he was mulling over wasn't necessarily exactly Assignment Earth at that point, but it was a similar concept to another writer who came in around the time of John Meredith Lucas, called Art Wallace, who then he ended up writing what would become Assignment Earth, which was the second season finale with. And so it was all it was based on some ideas that he'd had about a separate show, not necessarily connected to Star Trek, that then when Star Trek was being recommissioned and then it was coming towards the end, it was put in as a second season finale. And that was at the point then they started to go, oh, actually, maybe there's another spin-off here. Maybe there's another show. So it sort of it came around at different points and different people with similar sort of takes on a similar idea came together to make this work, I think, is roughly how the history goes for it.
That makes a lot of sense, because in some ways it doesn't feel like a spin-off. It doesn't quite feel, I mean, obviously we've got now with Picard, we're kind of getting back into this aspect of Star Trek lore. But to me anyway, it feels like a slightly uncomfortable fit. Maybe less so with the original series where, the rules were a bit looser and what Star Trek was a bit less clear at that stage. But that certainly makes sense to me, that it was originally intended as an unconnected story that then got kind of wedged into a Star Trek episode. And certainly I think Assignment Earth, it has many charms, but it also feels very much like two things smashed together. I mean, presumably, if this is the season 2 finale, this could easily have been the last ever episode of Star Trek, right? And that would have been, I mean, people complain about the way Enterprise went out with, Riker and Troy. I feel like this could have been a similar conversation somehow.
Well, it might have been even less of an effective finale than Turnabout Intruder was, which could have just been any kind of episode, I think, really, in season 3 or any other season. It wasn't anything like a finale, a closed, but this, an episode that's basically a completely different show in many ways. Yeah, that would have really been even more, or would it have been controversial? Because as you say, television in the 60s was different. People weren't necessarily primed to expect storylines to flourish in a climactic cliffhangering sort of arc. That was very much what television gave birth to, particularly in the 80s, really. And then you saw in things in Star Trek, I think the main one that really kicked that off was Best of Both Worlds, obviously in season 3 of TNG. But so there wasn't quite even the first 2 seasons of TNG don't really end on a traditional finale as such. In some ways, they could be episodes that could be placed in different places along a season. So I think the rules were slightly different, particularly in the 1960s, as to what function. People just turned up for a show, for an episode, for another adventure, and they weren't thinking in those kind of lines. That's not to say that you're not correct in that it's quite jarring as a finale. But yeah, I don't think they thought in those terms. And I think with Assignment Earth, there definitely was one eye on maybe this can become, if not a spin-off. I think they had more in their minds that this might be the next show that Roddenberry made, and Star Trek was just going to go away and that they wouldn't do anymore. So I think there was very much a case of, and I suppose that's slightly different from what we would imagine a backdoor pilot now to be. And I know we'll talk about this, but something like the end of Discovery, season 2 with Pike and the Enterprise, where they very clearly had one eye on Strange New Worlds. Whereas in this case, I think it was just more about, well, Star Trek was another show that we did, a bit like when Roddenberry did The Lieutenant before Star Trek. And this is going to be the next one, without any kind of realizing and comprehension that Star Trek was going to become this, era-defining icon of the 20th century.
Well, I'd love to know the kind of behind the scenes of season 2 of Discovery, because I mean, one reason I wanted to sort of schedule this chat for now is because we've got Strange New Worlds debuting, and to me, that does feel very much like a season-long backdoor pilot for that show. I don't know whether that was intentional. It's kind of hard to imagine it wasn't intentional at some level, although the narrative they will give out is, oh, this wasn't us, this was the fans. The fans came to us and demanded this show, and, we're giving the fans what they want. And I think in many ways, Strange New Worlds absolutely is a show that is giving the fans what they want. But I don't know, it's hard to imagine, even if when they started writing that season, if that wasn't what they had in mind, by the time you get to the end of it, you're right, and you get to see the Enterprise, and you get you get Spock back in his, shaving his beard and everything. It does feel like, surely they've got half an eye on that. Although, maybe it'll be years before we get the kind of full gossip on exactly what was going on there. But this phenomenon of the backdoor pilot, I think it is an interesting one. And I suppose maybe baked into it is this idea that it's an episode of a show where there's something wrong with it, if you know what I mean. It registers. It's kind of, there's like I said, there's a clash or whatever. I mean, I was just looking at the website TV Tropes, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Great website, at the backdoor pilot examples on there. And they said basically, you're watching a backdoor pilot when a load of new characters suddenly appear and the regular characters sort of drift into the background and don't seem to be doing very much. And you think, hang on a minute, what's going on? And invariably, yes, what's going on is they're trying to draw your attention to another group of people. It struck me, I think there are various instances in Star Trek where intentionally or otherwise we could talk about kind of backdoor pilot syndrome going on. One that hadn't really occurred to me until we just started recording a minute ago is Lower Decks, which is obviously an episode that gets then a whole TV show spun off from it. But Lower Decks is the classic, case of an episode where the central characters become peripheral and peripheral characters, new characters, become central. Obviously, they didn't go off and do a Lower Decks series, then. It took another 20 years or whatever. But I suppose that, in a way, is an episode that you could say almost has the feel of a backdoor pilot without the intention of being one.
Yeah. I think that's a good shout, really. I mean, when that was made, obviously, you're talking, when was that? 1993, something along those lines, 94. It's a different world in terms of Star Trek and how television's being produced, because I wonder if at that period, maybe even less so than in the 60s, they sort of had any kind of mind, and you might know differently, Duncan, you might have read things, but whether they had any mind on doing backdoor pilots for shows within that universe that were completely different, because it seemed very much like they were set on the path that has completely now changed, in that it's a ship or a space station in DS9's case, but then they get the Defiant in the end, so it kind of still becomes a ship and a crew and adventures and going out into space. And they very much stuck to that format throughout the entire run from 87 to 2005. So at any point, even though there are lots of these interesting way stations, something like Lower Decks, would they have thought in those terms to go, actually, there is an opportunity to explore a different caveat of this universe there and take that into... Yeah, television's changed so much now in that, things can spin off into a mini-series, through streaming and through all of these different things. Things can spin off into a movie. There's so much more fluidity now to how they produce things than there ever was in the days of networks where they had to fill 24, 25 episode seasons. And they just weren't in the space they were going to do that. So I think, if anything now, even though maybe there are, less egregious examples than this out there, I think, if anything, we're in a better position now to have the idea of backdoor pilots. A perfect example in the modern era is Terra Firma for Giorgio. And well, obviously we know that Giorgio is going to get a Section 31 show. That is consistently what they keep saying is going to happen. And we sort of knew that before she went out of it. But at the same time, that is a perfect example of spinning someone off for their own thing. And you can do that now. You can do that Section 31 show. You can have all these, and as much as I am, we've talked in other things, I'm not always sure about the quality of modern Star Trek. The fact they do vary all these different ideas within a universe is a really interesting thing. So I don't know. I mean, were they even in the headspace to do this back then, when things like the TV show, the TV episode Lower Decks was being premiered? It seems hard to imagine in a way.
It does. I agree. It doesn't seem like that was the way that they developed new shows. I mean, certainly Discovery is an interesting one, because Discovery, I suppose, is that's the show that brought Star Trek back after this massive hiatus. And it does feel like a show that every so often chucks out an episode that could be from a different series, and almost seems to be setting one up. I mean, yeah, you're right. We had Giorgio's Section 31, not just in that episode, Terra Firma, but of course also in season 2 of Discovery. As much as it's a backdoor pilot for Strange New Worlds, it's also a backdoor pilot for this Section 31 show, because they were already planning that at that stage, I think. We had also in that season the Klingon episode, Point of Light, which feels very out of place to me, both in Discovery and in Star Trek more generally. It feels like this sort of Klingon Game of Thrones type episode, and it features primarily Ash Tyler and L'Rell, two supporting characters, essentially. The focus is not on and also Emperor Giorgio. The focus is not on the kind of regular cast. And it comes quite early in that season to be doing something as sort of experimental as that. That feels very much like testing the waters for, what would a kind of ultra-violent, crazy Klingon type show be like. Then we've got, again in Discovery, we've got the Starfleet Academy set up for Tilly. And we know that for years they've been talking about doing the Starfleet Academy show. We know that Tilly has been written out maybe not totally written out of Discovery, but, you know, certainly written off the bridge of Discovery. Is that a backdoor pilot for a Tilly-centred Starfleet Academy show?
I think
we kind of assumed Starfleet Academy was going to be in a previous timeline that we're familiar with, but it could equally well be in that timeline. And again, it sort of feels like they were testing the waters with that episode. We've got Tilly and a bunch of cadets out in peril. It's a role that we had never seen her in before. It kind of came a bit out of the blue. Suddenly she's, you know, this teacher, and then she's off, and, you know, she's got this new sort of future ahead of her. I mean, Discovery does feel like a show as well. There was a point in season 4 I was watching, I was thinking, gosh, this is like sort of Star Trek HR or something. I mean, the number of people coming and going constantly with every episode, you know, oh yeah, I'm going off to do this, or, oh, here's so-and-so's come back and we haven't seen it. You know, it got to a point where I was like, is this deliberate? Is this, what are they representing here? Because there's so much kind of coming and going with the regular cast and sort of shuffling them around. And we get it with Picard as well. I'd say that first episode of season 2 of Picard, maybe that's more a sign of what season 3 of Picard is going to be on the Stargazer. I don't know, but that felt like a pilot for another, for a Stargazer series. I mean, everyone was immediately saying, give us the Stargazer series. Okay, we know Picard as a show, its days are numbered, but, you know, give us some of these characters coming back in, I suppose, a more sort of conventional Star Trek series. But in terms of what they were thinking in the 90s, I think that's an interesting question. I don't know that they were thinking in terms of spinning off shows off of episodes like that. But where I think they do something quite similar is with the Marquee, because the Marquee, I believe, were invented for Voyager, but they put a lot of work in both Next Generation and Deep Space Nine to lay the groundwork. Arguably, they laid it too well, in a sense, for what Voyager was actually going to do with it. But there was a real concerted effort there, and that was a point where, you know, you really did have the kind of Star Trek TV universe, and these 3 shows working together to try and tell a sort of coordinated story where one leads into the other.
As we've been talking, though, I've been wondering, is there a difference between a backdoor pilot and a backdoor concept? So what I mean by this is, Tilly, for example, and I agree, I think that is absolutely going to spin off into a Starfleet Academy show. I would put money on that. But the Tilly episode, it's whether or not they bring back those characters, or they're introducing the idea of Tilly working with cadets. Similarly with Giorgio, they've layered in Section 31 being, but a lot of those characters in section, like characters like Leland, I can't imagine they're going to come back for a Section 31 series. They've layered in the idea that
Leland is slightly done for, isn't he?
Right, exactly, right.
Didn't he get exploded or something by Giorgio by the end of it?
Something happened like that. So there are certain characters I don't necessarily think. I imagine if Giorgio gets spun off into this show that, you know, they're talking up being like a version of Guardians of the Galaxy-ish style kind of Section 31 stuff, that she will end up with an entirely different new cast. Whereas a backdoor
She'll have Ash Tyler, surely, won't she? I mean, isn't that... Well, I sort of assumed that was the idea. It's Giorgio and Ash, and...
That would make sense. That would make sense.
Group. And I imagine L'Rell will come back into things.
Yeah.
Maybe in Strange New Worlds as well. I mean, she hasn't so far in the episodes that we've seen, but that would kind of be a bit of a no-brainer in some ways, wouldn't it? But certainly with the Section 31, because she's got that link to Ash and that kind of history there. Yeah,
it would make sense. And given that, you know, people like Mary Chieffo are still very involved with the fandom, you know, and that kind of thing. So it feels like, so that would make, those are good examples of characters who might go with it. But then around that, there might be other, but the conceptually, I don't know if, you know, in terms of an episode that has actually introduced that world, like a good example, non-Star Trek, but a perfect example of a backdoor pilot was an episode they did right at the very end of The American Office called The Farm. And it was around the character of Dwight. And it took the characters completely away from the office, and it took them to his beet farm, I think it was, in the countryside. And he introduced his family, and it was literally, for the whole episode, pretty much just Dwight and his family, completely new load of characters. It told a story in that 30 minutes. And then by the end, it was very much set up for the show. You could literally then do The Farm, the Office spin-off, have it called The Farm. And then next season, once The Office finishes, you've got Rainn Wilson, who obviously has a Star Trek connection himself, who might well turn up in Strange New Worlds. Who knows? That wouldn't surprise me either. But
maybe.
But
that one. Yeah, but you're right.
But no, that was very much there, poised. That could have been done. It just didn't happen in the end. They pitched it. It almost happened. It didn't happen. But that was there. Whereas a lot of these conceptual ideas, whereas that's the difference, I think, with the Discovery and Pike and Enterprise stuff, because in a way, I think that was a backdoor prequel, I guess, to Strange New Worlds that we're getting. So it had set up in many ways a lot of the characters, and yeah, Strange New Worlds had introduced new characters, but it had set up number one, Spock, Pike. I don't know if there's anyone else who was in Discovery who was seen on Strange New Worlds. I can't remember.
I don't think there is actually, and that's quite an interesting point because they did carry over other characters. I mean, there was this whole controversy over Yeoman Colt and whether they'd actually misassigned which character was, which I think is highly likely because there's a cat, pretty much an extra who looked like she could easily have been Yeoman Colt, and then they claimed that Yeoman Colt was an alien in this version. Who knows? Right. I don't know what was going on there, but yeah, there were other characters tied to the Cage continuity. I mean, the other thing, talking about backdoor pilots in Star Trek is, is Discovery Season 2 a backdoor pilot for Strange New Worlds? Maybe. Is the Menagerie a backdoor pilot for Strange New Worlds? I mean, technically it is, obviously not intentional, but that was the broadcast episode that was, reconstructed out of the crashed, disfigured remains of the Cage. And that's in kind of canon, in continuity or whatever, that's what went out, was the Menagerie. And that is where we get these characters from. And in Discovery Season 2, they play on that with that brilliant intro to the episode, if memory serves, where you see clips from the Cage and then it sort of seamlessly transitions into Anson Mount as Pike.
I love that.
On the bridge of Discovery, which is beautifully done, I think, and really sort of selling the idea. There's continuity here. This is the same people. This is the same situation. Yeah, okay, we've had to recast, obviously, 50 years later, but it is about these people. It's not just about the kind of concept. So I think you're right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair point. You could say there's three types of thing we're talking about here. So we're talking about with Assignment Earth, yes, obviously it was going to be Gary Seven and Roberta Lincoln, and they were going to be the heroes of the new show, and they're the people we want to get you to know. With these Discovery instances, maybe they're sort of more setting up a style or a kind of sandbox to play in, or a kind of particular kind of storytelling. With the Marquis in 90s Trek, they're more just setting up a kind of idea and trying to sort of layer it in and prepare the audience for it, I suppose, and build up some of that stuff. But they're all different ways of doing it, and maybe probably it's fair to say Assignment Earth is the only, strictly speaking, backdoor pilot in Star Trek. But as you say, loads of shows have them. I mean, the X-Files certainly has one, because there was a spin-off with the Lone Gunman, right? But before they did that, I think there was an episode of the X-Files which probably is called The Lone Gunman. Is that right?
Well,
which was
not
basically
quite
a Lone Gunman episode.
Actually,
it wasn't. Oh, right. Okay.
Well, they did it the other way round. So they had the characters who were established. They then did a show, and then they did an episode of the X-Files that was a sequel and a wrap-up for those characters. So they sort of flipped it round in an interesting way.
I knew they did that with Millennium. I didn't realise they did that with Lone Gunman too.
Yeah.
So they did that twice, essentially. Okay,
and I think there was a point in the same season of the X-Files where the Lone Gunman was running canonically. There was a reference in one of the episodes of the X-Files with a character in blue or something, and a character just went, "What's that about?" And they went, "Oh, it's a long story." So there was sort of, but it wasn't, it wasn't sort of quite the same thing. But no, it's the same kind of idea though, that you will kind of overlap and do these things, and I think. And, that there are legion amounts of backdoor pilots. I mean, or ideas that in TV shows that didn't go anywhere, that they liked the idea of a character and they just wanted to test the water. And I think you'd find quite a lot of that, really. I mean, something like Starfleet Academy, if it is meant to be a Tilly show or a Tilly fronted led show with lots of other characters, that could be one of those things that they end up thinking twice about the direction there. Whereas I think with someone like Giorgio, you have an actor in Michelle Yeoh who is world renowned. She is currently like in everything right now. Like there is not a show
in everything, everywhere, all at once, right?
Yeah, wow, there you go. Yeah, you you said it. And so she's hugely popular, and I think that's a slam dunk in many ways. You've got an actor that will draw people in. You have a concept that I think is. I mean, that in a way is the riskiest one, because it is essentially taking what was a very controversial Star Trek idea in the 90s and running with it as an adventure, action, spy series, which I think really has the fandom split down the middle. And if I'm honest, I would wager that there are more doubting Thomases with this one than people who are really looking forward to it right now, because they don't know what it looks like.
But do you know what? I felt like that about Strange New Worlds. I was not one of these fans clamoring for it. I thought that was going to be a bit of fan service. And I mean, you and I have both seen first half of the first season of Strange New Worlds. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was fantastic. And I can very much see why. I think people are going to say this is what we've been waiting for 5 years. Do you know what I mean? This is the Star Trek we've been waiting for. Yeah. It feels very classic Trek, but not in a kind of lazy retreading. It's not that they've necessarily taken the easy path, if you know what I mean, but it's a show that absolutely knows what it's doing and knows what it is more than I think any Star Trek show, since Discovery came on the air, maybe with the exception of Lower Decks, which I think is pretty much knows what it's doing for sure. And I love all of those shows in various ways, but I think Strange New Worlds is the one that has the most kind of confidence in a way out of the gate. So I don't know. It's interesting. That's just to say maybe when they have a really strong idea, whether we like the idea or not, we should kind of go with it and see, because I think that in itself is something to recommend itself.
I think it helps, I think, when you've got established stuff there. I mean, taking nothing away from Strange New Worlds, because it is out the gate a confident piece of work. There's a lot of, if people listen to this and they haven't watched it yet, or they're just about to watch it, you really are in for a treat, I think. And I think it will appeal to modern and new classical and modern Star Trek fans. But I think they had a bit of a head start in the fact that Pike, Spock, to some degree, number one, are quite well-established Star Trek characters. And, you've got other ones in there. You've got Uhura, you've got, Mbenga, you've got Chapel.
But Chapel and Mbenga are, absolute standouts for me. I mean, Chapel, I've never particularly been keen on Chapel as a character, but this version of Chapel is amazing.
She is good.
It's kind of I mean, some people don't like retconning or whatever, but this is an example of retconning a character and just almost making her a completely different character, but it works so well. So
I think it's an example of creating a character, if anything, really, out of just a very basic template that you had in the 60s, because they didn't really pay much attention to the very ancillary. I mean, blimey, even some of the bridge crew, classic beloved characters, didn't have a lot of character development in that era. It was Kirk, Spock, and McCoy who had the stories for the most part, bar one or two exceptions, and that won't be the case with this, because we're in an era now where a character, I say that Discovery, this is where Discovery's got it wrong, because they haven't fleshed out their bridge crew at all. They haven't. They've done very much like TOS in many ways, and I think that's a weakness of the storytelling, whereas I think Strange New Worlds won't do that. But I think in some ways the fact that some of these characters are well known, or they have a precedent, and the concept is easy. It's the Enterprise. I mean, it is the ultimate classic Star. It is the original series, essentially. Again, it is. Well,
it's the original series that we didn't get. I mean, it's literally, that Star Trek is. This is what Star Trek was before the original series. Do you know what I mean? This is the show that The Cage would have become. With a 50 years hence massive budget and whatever. But it is exactly. It's a sort of essentially Star Trek as you can be in that sense.
Yeah, it really is. And I think we will get the 5-year mission here. I have no doubt about that. I think absolutely we will. And it will become quite legendary in that sense, I think, because people will talk about it in years to come as being the 5-year mission that Star Trek in the 60s never got. And it will line up with that, I think, very well. And I think it does have a head start in that sense as a backdoor pilot concept. And I think it is a fusion of the two. Whereas with a lot of these other examples, there is a lot more legwork to do, for something like, and that's why I think Lower Decks has been so interesting, is because they didn't make that TNG show. Mike McMahon didn't choose to just make that TNG show. He didn't just choose to remake that same concept. He decided to do it not just animated either, but he decided, because you could have made that as a live action thing. You could have absolutely done a Lower Decks show live action, but it would have been it wouldn't have been what we got. He's made quite a wacky animated show out of that, and he's created very different characters for that show. And it's interesting how that as a backdoor concept in a way 20, 30 years later, took on a very different self-mocking, lampooning show that had the space to actually look back at particularly 90s Star Trek and find the comedy in the way the storytelling happens. And that's the thing, in that the storytelling in Star Trek now is much more modern in its presentation and structure and style, for better or worse. Whereas the 90s Star Trek, in some ways, is ripe for comedy. And I think the fact that he took that and did something different with it is a fascinating factor in given how long it was since that episode came out.
It just struck me when you were talking about Strange New Worlds, though, and this idea of these characters. I mean, obviously with Lower Decks, it's sort of taken the concept and the title, but none of those actual people are carried over. But with Strange New Worlds, I think you're right. They've got an advantage insofar as people are familiar with these characters, but they're familiar in so many different ways. I mean, first of all, everyone is familiar with Spock because Spock is a part of the kind of cultural landscape anyway, right? So Spock is kind of there already. Pike, everyone who watches Star Trek is familiar with Pike and Number One because they have this kind of iconic position. And of course, Uhura, because we know Uhura. Anyone who wasn't familiar with Star Trek but has got in via like the Abrams films and probably watches Discovery now knows Pike and Number One through season 2 of Discovery. So it's like for every potential audience member, they've already been primed for this show, which is quite clever. You know, if it's by design, it's quite clever. If it's not by design, it's very convenient for them, I think. So the show can really hit the ground running. I mean, it doesn't have to have a 2-hour pilot. It can have a 1-hour first episode that, you know, is barely a pilot, to be honest. I mean, yeah, we've got Pike shaving his beard or whatever, but I mean, you know, basically just an episode of this show, in a sense, isn't it? And it doesn't have to do all that kind of setting up, faffing around stuff that, you know, usually we got a double episode. Picard, we kind of got 3 episodes. It can just kind of start a bit like the original series. Just, you know, they could almost they did essentially pick an episode and say, we'll put that one out first. And that's our introductory episode. You know, it kind of can jump into it right away because they've done all that work and kind of laid out all that stuff with those characters beforehand. And obviously there's a lot of backstory for some of the other characters and indeed some of those characters. And there's the whole thing for Pike, you know, which we learned from Discovery, that he actually knows his fate. So they kind of built a whole, not just backstory, but like forward story baked into that character. But it's very much enough is established that we know who these people are and we can kind of just get on with it at this stage. And I think that is a big advantage to them.
No, it is. It's a huge advantage in a way that a lot of these other examples don't have. And that's why it would have been interesting to see that Assignment Earth spin-off if it had been linked to Star Trek, because it would have been the most untethered thing that they've ever done in this franchise. I mean, even with all these different, you know, examples of testing the water with animated shows, with styles, with different, you know, parts of the universe, not being around Starfleet all the time, etc., which they've done since 2017. This would have been completely separate, you know, set on Earth in the, you know, the 60s, whatever, maybe even early 70s. And it would be the equivalent now of doing a spin-off with Tallinn from Picard and having Orla Brady get her own show as this, you know, watcher, or even if you do a spin-off with Tallinn and Guinan teaming up, you know, on modern Earth, you know, which some people would really love. I think
someone will be calling for that already.
They will.
Don't worry. You know?
They will be, because what you find,
the fan fiction's already been written, I bet.
And that's precisely it, though. You get nowadays, particularly, fan bases built around actors. I mean, that's the only way, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, but the only reason that we've had so much Tallinn is because everyone loved Orla Brady as Laris. You know, and it will be interesting to see what the reaction has been amongst fans who didn't get Laris this season, because they've almost cheated. They've kept Orla Brady in with it as a different character, and she's not Laris. And I think some fans might be like, well, it's not really what we wanted. You know, we wanted Laris. You know, why didn't Laris just come back into the past with them and all these kind of things? You know, why couldn't you?
With Soji, we don't get Soji. We get whatever her name is.
We get Corey, or whatever it is.
Corey, yeah.
Yeah, so exactly. So it's a little bit of a cheat. But I think you find these days that certain fan bases, and you do see this a lot with Star Trek, they build around a certain character. I mean, I'll be amazed if people aren't calling for a Seven and Raffi spin-off by the time Picard is finished, because I think they are such popular, particularly Seven, and Seven's always been popular, I think. But now with how Voyager is so much more back in vogue in so many ways in terms of Star Trek, the idea of having a Seven and Raffi, Seven as a ranger or whatever, or even and quite often you get the calls for the captain shows, don't you? I mean, people are joking, and we've joked about Captain Rios for years. There was.
I'm not joking. I'm down for that one.
We'd love that.
And again, I'd be surprised if they don't end up doing it, to be honest, in some form or other, because I think he has got so much kind of charisma, and he's a great character that we've been introduced to, and they've given him a ship now, so why not? Although we'll see, maybe he stays on Earth in Picard season 2 by the end, and
well,
I don't know.
We'll find out soon. But yeah, exactly. As we record, that's the thing. I think before you've had the talks of a Captain Worf show, or before that you had Captain Sulu and all these things. Although I think to some extent it was the actors lobbying more than everyone else, but I still think there is appetite for those kind of things, and it's built often, I think, around characters, which is why, just to go back to my earlier point, where I started with this, would Assignment Earth been as successful at a point where were people in the 1960s desperate for a Robert Lansing fronted TV series with Gary Seven? I don't know, because I don't know if fandom quite worked in the same way then, and because it was still in that very nascent point, and you had Star Trek fandom really kicked off under the threat of cancellation, and particularly in the 1970s, but people wanted that show. I don't know if they wanted the what would have been a fascinating show, much more sort of Mission Impossible James Bondy in the the late 60s, or with a little bit of The Prisoner in there, maybe, with set on Earth. It would have been fantastic. It would have been a real artifact of that Cold War sort of period, with the kitsch 60 stuff going on. But I don't know if it would have lasted. I don't think people would have been talking about it now in the way that they talk about Star Trek, So I think sometimes a lot of it is about both concepts and the people in these shows, and not just the characters, but the actors. And I think there's a real fusion of all that goes into whether some of these backdoor pilots are made. You could have a great character that seems built for a spin-off show, but for some reason, and Dwight from The Office is a perfect example of this. A character who worked really well in that show, but when I watched that episode, The Farm, part of me was like, I don't know if I'd want this every week. I don't know if he's a lead character. And I think that decision was the right one. I think they did the right thing not making that into a series. So it is interesting how these decisions are made, and even though it might seem like a perfectly set up thing, maybe sometimes it is right not to go there.
I think that's a really interesting point. And obviously, a lot of these backdoor pilots, if you go to TV Tropes and look at the list of backdoor pilots, a lot of them didn't end up becoming shows. Including Assignment Earth. We didn't get Assignment Earth. We get it in the novels. There's some great stuff in Greg Cox's novels about the eugenics wars with Gary Seven, and
they did comics,
and in the comics they did a comic run, didn't they? Yeah. So I suppose that lives on in various ways, but we didn't get a TV show, and I think it's an interesting question. Does it work as a TV show? I have to say, I find Gary Seven a little bit dull. I love Roberta Lincoln. I think she works.
Yeah, she's good.
A bit in the same way as I love Rain Robinson. I wouldn't mind. Give Rain Robinson a show dealing with aliens in the present day or something back in the 90s. I don't know. She stands out, and I think it's got great kind of tech. It's got that cloudy portal, which they bring back in Picard. Very cool. It's got the voice recognition typewriter. It's got some great elements that you can see would make it quite a charming contemporary, like you say, sort of contemporary sci-fi / spy kind of show. It's hard to say, isn't it? Would it have been a classic? Probably not. Would it have been fun? Yeah, maybe. But again, it's that weird sense when you watch the episode Assignment Earth, and I don't know whether this is one reason I sort of have always assumed the idea is that it didn't take off because Star Trek came back for another year, and that maybe otherwise it would have done. But I don't think the actors were signed up either. I think there was some question mark as to whether it was kind of a goer, practically speaking, and for what, obviously if the networks had seen it and absolutely loved it, they probably would have commissioned it, wouldn't they? And they didn't. So I don't know. It's an interesting one. I think it's quite a fun sort of romp. I would happily watch more stories of those characters, but maybe it didn't quite do enough to sell them. And I suppose, the thing about a backdoor pilot is it really does have to it has to serve two masters. It has to function at least partly as an episode of the show that it's in, and then it has to function strongly enough as a pilot for another show. And doing a good pilot for a show is hard. Yeah. It's a lot of work. It's hard to do it in a single episode. It's one reason we often do get feature length pilots, because you need time to set stuff up. It's kind of a tall order, but as I say, it's one among many on the list of backdoor pilots or potential spin-offs that kind of never came to be. I mean, another one in fairly recent years, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., they had this whole kind of storyline that was geared towards a spin-off for the Mockingjay character, and they even gave them a sort of farewell episode. They gave her and her husband, I can't think of his name,
Lance Hunter,
these two characters that were going to get their own spin-off. Right, yeah. Gave them their own spin-off, farewell episode, wrote them out of the main show in a fairly kind of drastic way, and then their spin-off never happened. It's kind of a terrible shame. They lost these two characters for nothing, basically. I hope that's not what's happening to Emperor Giorgio. If Section 31 doesn't happen, then have they just, I mean, I don't know. Maybe that was the right call anyway, because she was always a little bit of an odd element in Discovery.
Well,
but, that's the danger, I suppose, if you write these characters out of one show with an intention of them going into another, and then for whatever reason that doesn't come off, then they're kind of out in the cold, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And also, I think a lot of these projects, they exist in a certain continuum. That's not a Q joke, but they exist in a certain time and space, I think. I mean, you couldn't really, you can do it in a comic, sure. You can do it in a novel, sure. But you couldn't really remake Assignment Earth now and it be the same thing as they imagined in the 60s. You couldn't make the same idea with Tallinn and a cat that's also a shapeshifter and, have her partnered up with someone. It wouldn't be quite the same thing, because that show, for instance, would have been designed, especially with Gary Seven, to reflect all of the, the big political cultural anxieties of the time, and the idea that he was protecting humans, and trying to protect a future that, was going to go terribly wrong and all this kind of thing. You could have some sort of similar parallel now, but I think it would be more cynical now in many ways. I think that times have changed. And similarly, I think they've got to be careful about the Giorgio thing, because that is going to have a shelf life. They've got to get on that fairly quickly. Michelle Yeoh is still young enough to convincingly carry a show. Sure. She doesn't seem to age, that woman. She's incredible, really. But, and she's in a prime. Arguably, she might even be in a career peak right now. Despite everything else going on in her past. But I think they have to jump on that fairly quickly, because these things exist in a vacuum of interest as well. It's like, imagine trying to do a Tilly-fronted Starfleet Academy spin-off 5 years after Discovery's ended, and Star Trek in some ways has moved on into goodness knows what we're going to get. I think that these things, they have to, if they're going to happen, they have to happen fairly quickly. And I think you would have found that in the 90s, had they chosen to do spin-offs around certain characters, had they chosen to follow certain threads, had they chosen to do a marquee show, and had they chosen to actually go down that road
but
properly,
Tony,
and explore
they did do a marquee show, Star Trek Voyager, haven't you seen it? But yeah, no, you're right. And it made me think, when you were thinking about certain characters, obviously there was a character like Rolaran was a character they wanted to put on DS9, didn't they? They did try. Yeah. And I was reading something, I hadn't realised this, but the episode Disaster, that one reason that the episode Disaster features both Miles and Keiko quite prominently, and also Ro, is that was intended as they were already kind of planning on DS9 would have had all three of those characters kind of ported over. But I think it is interesting, and I think there's also this kind of question of tone. When you're setting up not just the individual characters for a show, but the kind of tone of the show, and I think that's one reason why the Marquis arc doesn't feed into Voyager, or doesn't feel like it feeds into Voyager. It's like, first of all, they were working backwards. So they knew that Voyager was going to have this Marquis storyline, and they sort of needed to set up the Marquis. But then they gave it to DS9, and DS9 did brilliant DS9 stuff with the Marquis, and the Marquis fit perfectly in DS9. It's kind of political issue. It's quite Shades of Grey kind of issue. It's absolutely in the DS9 wheelhouse. Then you get Next Gen doing episodes like Journey's End, Preemptive Strike, which feel very much like DS9 episodes, to be honest, not Next Gen episodes. I mean, in a good way, I would say, very into the kind of nitty gritty of the politics again, and the kind of Shades of Grey and all this sort of stuff that works well on DS9. But then you get to Voyager, and none of that really translates. So you've got this weird thing where all of this work has been done to set up this conflict and to set up this issue between the Maquis and Starfleet. But the premise of Voyager as this kind of lost in space story just doesn't really fit, because the whole issue with the Maquis, we're kind of retreading old ground here, I think, but the whole issue with the Maquis is a specific located political crisis, in the demilitarized zone, in that particular part of space and with those particular people. If you take them all 70,000 light years away, who cares? It's not relevant, and all they're left with really is there's a load of guys who, they were in Starfleet and they got fed up and they kind of, did naughty things for one reason or another. But it doesn't really matter. The whole, what was meaningful for the Maquis in those other episodes, whether it's Next Gen or DS9, it's 70,000 light years away. They're probably never going to see those places again. It's a fundamental flaw, I think, in the thinking that went into that. On the other hand, look, maybe it didn't work out brilliantly in Voyager. It could have been another group of, dissatisfied, disgruntled Starfleet types, or however you wanted to do it. But it did pay off pretty well, I would say, in that final season of Next Gen. And then going forward with Deep Space Nine, with characters like Eddington and that whole kind of arc, they managed to make quite a lot of mileage out of it, I'd say. But it is a case of something that was, it was a Voyager idea that ended up becoming something that only really works in the kind of DS9 tonal approach to Trek.
And it was sort of used. I would encourage anyone to go and read, if they haven't already, Ronald D. Moore's interviews about Voyager some years after the show ended. I'm sure you've read them, Duncan, but they're fantastic because he's so candid. And, he basically does say, it's why one of the reasons I created Battlestar Galactica, I brought that back because I wanted to do that kind of story. That's what Voyager should have been. I mean, the thought of that is tantalizing, but it just wasn't ready. Star Trek wasn't ready. There's a chance that might happen. That kind of thing might happen nowadays. They might have the bravery to go down that road with a series and to create something like that. Although the irony is people would moan about it, probably. People would moan and say, this isn't what it is. So there's an irony to that, in that people, a lot of people said, oh, Voyager squandered its potential. But at the same time, I mean, look at it now. It's beloved now. People watch it more on Netflix than anything else, or on Paramount Plus or whatever. So I think there's a difference between the idea of spinning off a show and a concept and trying to layer in characters and ideas into a show as part of the tapestry of something that's otherwise exactly the same. Voyager ended up just being the next generation in a different part of the galaxy. That's all it really was, and the whole idea of the Maquis was just part of the initial DNA, and they very quickly went, forget that, stuff that, we're just going to do TNG again. And that's the thing. I think when you're doing a genuine backdoor pilot, and when you're going to do a genuine spin-off show that takes an idea, and I think it's got to be something that is very clearly layered in, as we've talked about, into these shows, into these ideas. And that's why, yes, Assignment Earth is the only official backdoor pilot, but I do think that they had Strange New Worlds on their mind when they made Discovery Season 2. Whether or not they knew what it was called, whether or not they had made the decision about that, I would be very surprised if, when they decided to bring the Enterprise into end of Discovery Season 1, Akiva Goldsman or somebody didn't go, man, we need to do a series about this one day, and we need to spend this season getting people ready for that show. And whether or not that the story before the pilot of Strange New Worlds really needed to be told with those characters, I'm not sure. I think, if anything, Strange New Worlds might make Discovery Season 2 retrospectively better actually, than it was, because I think it might the doing all that first might actually have freed up Strange New Worlds to be what it is. So that might help me with like season 2 of Discovery more in the long run. But I think,
well, you know what I was going to say to you, Tony, because I know you're a bit of a hater on season 2 of Discovery. I went back and watched it in the last couple of weeks, only for the second time, to be honest. I never rewatched it, until now. It definitely works better for me on a second viewing. I think knowing where the story's going and what's going on and so on, it kind of frees you up to enjoy all the good stuff. And there is actually quite a lot of great stuff in that season, I would say, and not just, people tend to say, oh, Anson Mount is great, but the rest of it, doesn't quite work. I don't know if that's true. I think there's actually a lot in there. So I would recommend, give it a go sometime and see, because I think on a second viewing and also on a binge where you're not waiting a week at a time to see what happens next, you can forgive some of the slightly wonky plotting and sort of just enjoy the ride and the kind of high points that you get along the way. Well, but it's an interesting question, does it, if you do see it as a backdoor pilot, does it have the same problem that, Assignment Earth, arguably one problem with that episode is it's not a great Star Trek episode because the Star Trek people don't have much to do. Really, they're kind of hanging around and a lot of it is going on with these other characters. Is that a danger with season 2 of Discovery, that it became the kind of Pike show at the risk of losing focus on the Discovery story? I don't actually think it did necessarily. I feel like they balanced all of that fairly well. But that is always the risk, isn't it? Is that you bring someone like that in and they actually become the focus of the show somehow.
Well, I did have a real problem with the very final image of Discovery Season 2 being the Enterprise warping away. I did. I won't lie about that. I was a bit like, oh, come on, really? Like that's because why didn't you have that season end, with the characters that the show's about? So I did, but that might work better in retrospect. It is one of those things. But let's face it, Discovery's first 2 seasons both ended with the Enterprise being more important than the Discovery itself.
You're right.
So that they've spent most of that show layering in the show I think they really kind of wanted to do in the end, and the Discovery I think had been such a massive bowl of different ideas thrown together, mixed up, tossed aside, that by the time they got to that point, they couldn't make Discovery in the way that Strange New Worlds is being made because it was too far down the track in various different ways. And I think that it's not a backdoor. I don't think season 2 of Discovery and all the Pike and the Enterprise stuff is a backdoor pilot. I think it's a backdoor concept. And I think it is. I think we do have 3 very, very distinct things, like you said earlier. We've got the backdoor pilot, we've got the backdoor concept, we have the backdoor characters, which is a great example when you talked about Miles, Keiko, Rolaren. We have that. That could be, in theory, Tilly as well. I think we have 3 different sort of ideas here in terms of where Star Trek and lots of other, franchises try and layer in track. A good example in the rival sci-fi franchise. In Star Wars, in The Mandalorian, they layered in Boba Fett, and then they did the Book of Boba Fett, and then bafflingly decided to make an episode of The Mandalorian halfway through the Book of Boba Fett, which is bonkers. And that's the kind of thing, actually, I would hate to see Star Trek do. I would hate to have an episode of they do Section 31 with Giorgio, and suddenly in the middle you cut to Burnham and you cut to the Discovery, and there's a whole episode of Discovery that only tangentially links, because there's talk right now of how Star Wars is going to be more of a shared, the worry is that it's going to be more of a shared universe in the sense of there is no sort of complete solo singular story going on, and that they might just literally throw in an episode of Kenobi into the middle of Ahsoka, or they might just, all these things. And I think that's really dangerous because I think that takes away, the Book of Boba Fett ended up being rubbish for a lot of it precisely because it spent so long sidelining Boba Fett. It was bizarre, and I think that's what they've got to be really careful of, because I think one of the great things about Star Trek that they've managed to do, and now we're so far down the franchise rabbit hole, this is hard to see, but Star Trek still manages to keep all of these shows relatively self-contained, even though they have overlapping continuity in many ways. They all tell individual stories that are pretty disconnected from each other, quite often nowadays through different time periods, let alone different parts of the galaxy. And in a way, I think that's quite good because it allows each of these shows to feel relatively distinct from each other. You know, I mean, I'll say that for them. Discovery and Picard and Lower Decks and, you know, Prodigy are nothing like each other, really. They share common DNA, but they're completely different. And I think that's a good thing, you know, and I think that's something that as Star Trek does push into these does do these backdoor concepts or backdoor characters or whatever, I think it's a good thing. I think it will prevent the franchise becoming too stale. So while on the one hand, I'm delighted we've got Strange New Worlds because it feels like a Star Trek show, on the other, let's see what Section 31 is like, you know? Let's try it. Let's see how it works, because I think that in the long run, I think we're going to look back more favourably on the fact they did take risks that they never would have done in the 90s. And they didn't really do in the 60s either.
And it's interesting, you know, talking about the backdoor idea. I mean, this idea of portals. I mean, obviously we've got, you know, Assignment Earth, we've got these great kind of cloudy portals. Obviously, to get Giorgio back into Section 31, they had to use another portal, the Guardian of Forever, and, you know, transport her. I mean, there is this sense of, I suppose, as much as Star Trek can exist in these different kind of environments, different situations, different tones and so on, but there are these doors between them. You can have characters kind of cross back and forth to some extent. I was reading Will Wheaton was talking about wanting to come back as Wesley, and saying that, but he wants to come back as Wesley, you know, sort of super Wesley in Lower Decks, basically, with his traveller powers and so on. And he was saying, as far as he's concerned, Wesley and Nemesis in uniform, that was just him putting on a uniform to make everyone feel comfortable. And, you know, really Wesley is definitely still out there in a kind of godlike way. And that's the show he would crop up in. But he was sort of pointing out, actually, Wesley could, you know, if he can travel time and space, kind of like a Q or something, he could show up in any show, really. So there are these options. I suppose that's the thing. There are always possibilities. And I guess that's what these doors sort of offer, isn't it? Maybe it's not the back door, maybe it's not a pilot, but maybe it's that kind of interconnectedness. It's the magic mushroom network, isn't it? That kind of ties all of Star Trek together and lets you
Star
jump
Trek's
from one
own mycelial
show
network.
into another. It is, yeah.
I like that.
But anyway, I know you've got to get out through your own back door and get on with your book manuscript, Tony. But it's been a pleasure talking to you, as ever. And I'll see you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. And I hope everyone enjoys Strange New Worlds when they get to see it. It's great.
Absolutely. I think they will, for sure.
You're blended, all right.